All right, so we're diving into Isaiah 1.2731 today.
Right.
And we've got a couple of really interesting scholarly exegeses to work with,
Nice.
which means we're not just looking at the surface here, we're going deep.
Yeah.
Historical context, the grammar, the symbolism, all that good stuff. This passage is packed with imagery and meaning, and we're going to try to unpack it all, and most importantly, figure out what it means for you today.
You know, it's amazing to me how these ancient texts can still speak to us,
Thousands of years later.
thousands of years later. Yeah.
It really is. Okay, so the passage starts with a promise.
Yeah.
Zion shall be redeemed. Now, we know Zion represents God's people here, and the Hebrew grammar points to God directly acting like he's doing the redeeming. But it's not just a free pass, right?
Right.
This redemption hinges on justice and righteousness, and even today those are loaded terms. So what can you tell us about how they were understood back then?
Well, it's important to remember that in ancient Hebrew thought, justice, mishpat, and righteousness, tz'dakah, they weren't just abstract ideals. They were really about action. They were really about, living out the covenant faithfully. It was woven into the very fabric of society.
So it's about more than just, individual morality.
Absolutely. Think about the ideal king in the ancient Near East.
Okay.
His role was to maintain order and harmony, not just for himself, but for the entire community.
Yeah.
Mishpat and tz'dakah were the guiding principles of that order.
Right.
And they ensured fairness and balance and, right relationships, things that resonate even today.
And it seems like Isaiah is taking that concept and applying it to God's relationship with his people.
Exactly. It's this idea that God isn't just a distant observer.
Yeah.
He's actively involved in bringing about justice and righteousness within the covenant community.
Okay.
And that's how Zion is redeemed.
Okay, so that's the positive side. But then there's the flip side. What happens to those who reject this covenant, who choose rebellion over righteousness? And the text doesn't sugarcoat it.
No.
It says, rebels and sinners shall be destroyed together, consumed by their own choices. Now, to modern ears, that can sound pretty harsh.
It does sound harsh, yeah. But we need to understand it within the ancient worldview, within their mindset.
Okay.
The principle of blessings and curses tied to obedience was central to their thinking.
Right.
Go back to Deuteronomy.
Yeah.
Follow the covenant, you're blessed, stray from it, and you face consequences.
So is this destruction that Isaiah talks about, is it framed within that context? It's not just God being vindictive.
It's less about punishment and more about the natural consequences of turning away from the source of life and order. It's like a tree cutting itself off from its roots.
Yeah.
It's just going to wither and die.
Yeah, it's a great analogy. Okay, so let's move on to some of the imagery in this passage, which I think gets pretty intense. We've got these sacred oaks and gardens.
Right. But instead of being these places of peace and beauty, Isaiah says people are going to be ashamed of them. It seems like more than just, bad landscaping. What's going on here?
Well, this is where understanding the cultural context is so important.
Okay.
In 8th century BCE Judah, trees, especially oaks, were incredibly potent symbols. They were seen as these points of connection between heaven and earth.
Oh, wow.
Places where the divine could be accessed.
So not just random shade trees.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
And gardens were equally symbolic.
Right.
They represented agricultural abundance and royal power, even echoes of the Garden of Eden. But what Isaiah does is he flips these symbols on their head.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So it's like he's saying, you've turned your back on the true source, so even these things that should represent life and blessing are going to become sources of shame.
Precisely. And the imagery of a withered garden, especially the lack of water, that's particularly poignant in an arid land like Judah.
It speaks to a really profound spiritual dryness, this state of being cut off from what sustains you.
It's that feeling of emptiness.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of how we still talk about spiritual dryness today, that feeling of being disconnected, that lack of that true nourishment. Now, speaking of powerful imagery, let's talk about fire. The passage ends with this image of the strong becoming tinder in their works, becoming the spark that ignites them.
Yeah, fire always has this kind of duality to it, right?
Yeah.
It can be incredibly destructive, but it can also be used for purification.
Right, like refining metal in a furnace, intense heat, but it burns away impurities and leaves you with something stronger. So is Isaiah suggesting here that even divine judgment can have a purifying effect?
It's interesting you say that because that ambiguity is definitely there. In the ancient world, fire was often associated with both divine judgment and purification. It's almost as if Isaiah is inviting us to consider both aspects.
Both sides of the same coin, almost.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating. So we're left with this question, right? Is the fire purely destructive?
Yeah.
Or can it also be a path to refinement, even transformation?
Yeah, it's a question that I think continues to resonate even outside of a purely religious context.
Right.
We see this idea of trial by fire in all sorts of human experiences.
Yeah, for sure. So how do we connect these ancient ideas to the modern world? I mean, we don't exactly have sacred groves and gardens on every street corner. What are our modern day equivalents?
That's the challenge, right? To try to translate these ancient concepts into something that's relevant for our lives today.
Yeah.
Isaiah is talking about the consequences of choosing idols over God.
Yeah.
But what are our idols? What are the things that we prioritize over genuine connection or over our own well-being or even over our values?
That's a good question. It's interesting because those idols might even look good on the surface. Like, who doesn't want success or security or a comfortable life? But Isaiah seems to be warning us that if those things become our ultimate goals, if they take the place of God in our lives, they can actually lead to a different kind of emptiness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's that same image of the withered garden, but instead of a lack of water, it's a lack of meaning,
Right.
a lack of purpose. We might achieve all those things, but inwardly, we're still parched.
We're still empty? So how do we avoid that? How do we guard against those modern day idols and stay connected to what truly sustains us? Isaiah points us toward justice and righteousness, but how do those ancient concepts translate into practical action in the 21st century?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Remember, mishpat and tz'dakah weren't just about personal piety. They were about creating a just and harmonious society.
Yeah.
So if we want to apply those principles today, we have to look beyond ourselves, beyond our own individual needs and desires.
So it's not just about being a good person, it's about actively working towards a more just and equitable world.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the interconnectedness of all things,
Right.
understanding that our actions have an impact on others, and taking responsibility for that impact.
Yeah.
It's about advocating for those who are marginalized, speaking out against injustice, and working to create systems that uphold fairness and dignity for everyone.
Yeah. That's a tall order.
It is,
It is.
but it's also incredibly empowering.
Right.
It's about recognizing that we have a role to play in shaping the world around us, that we're not just passive observers, but active participants in this ongoing story of creation and redemption.
That's a good point. That brings us back to the idea of fire. Earlier, we were talking about it as a potential force for purification, even transformation. So what does that look like in a modern context?
Well, think about the challenges that we face in our own lives. The things that force us to confront our limitations or our fears or our deepest assumptions. Sometimes those experiences can feel incredibly destructive, like everything we thought we knew is being burned away.
Like you're being completely stripped bare.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But often, it's in those moments of intense heat, when we're forced to let go of the things that we've been clinging to, that we discover a new kind of strength, a new clarity of purpose.
So it's not about seeking out suffering, but about recognizing the potential for growth, even in the midst of painful experiences.
Exactly. It's about trusting that even when things feel like they're falling apart, there might be a deeper process of refinement happening beneath the surface.
Right. Okay. We've covered a lot of ground here. Judgment, redemption, idolatry, the power of fire. It's incredible how these ancient ideas still resonate with us today.
It really is.
It really is.
It's a testament to the enduring power of these texts to speak to the human condition, regardless of time or place.
Before we wrap up, I just want to ask you, what's one specific thing from Isaiah 1.2731 that really struck you, something our listeners can take away and ponder in their own lives?
For me, it's the link between mishpat and the specific social issues that we're facing today.
Yeah.
Isaiah connects righteousness with justice, with caring for the vulnerable. He's not being abstract here.
Right.
He's calling for specific actions to help those who are suffering.
That connection between personal righteousness and social action, it's so powerful. And it's something we often miss, I think.
Right.
We tend to compartmentalize those things, but Isaiah is saying they're inseparable.
Yeah, it's a very holistic vision of what it means to live in right relationship, with God and with each other.
Okay, so we've talked about the human side of things, but what about the divine side? What does this passage tell us about God's character? Because on the surface, it can seem, like a pretty harsh portrayal.
Yeah.
All the talk of judgment and fire.
It's true that he doesn't shy away from the consequences of rebellion,
Right.
but I think if we look deeper, we see a more complex picture.
There's that tension there, right?
Yeah.
Between judgment and mercy, between wrath and love.
Absolutely. And remember, the whole reason Zion is redeemed is because of God's love for his people. He
Yeah.
desires their well-being,
Yeah.
their flourishing. And that's why he sets out this path of justice and righteousness.
Right.
It's not about, arbitrary rules.
Mm-hmm.
It's about the way to true life, the way to a harmonious relationship with him and with each other.
So the consequences that Isaiah describes, they're not coming out of anger.
Right.
They're coming out of a desire for his people to turn back, to choose life over destruction.
It's like a parent who disciplines their child,
Yeah.
not because they enjoy punishing, but because they want what's best for them.
Right.
And sometimes that means allowing them to experience the natural consequences of their choices, even if it's painful.
It's a tough kind of love,
Yeah.
but love nonetheless. This passage really, it challenges us to confront our own understanding of God, doesn't it?
It does.
To move beyond these simplistic, one-dimensional images that we often carry.
Yeah, to see the fullness of his character,
Right.
the complexity, the paradox. He is both just and merciful, both powerful and compassionate.
And maybe, just maybe, that fire that we were talking about earlier, that refining fire that burns away our impurities, is ultimately an expression of his love, his desire to shape us into something more whole, more true to our deepest selves.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
Yeah.
It's not about being consumed by the flames, but about being refined, purified, transformed by them.
This has been such a rich conversation, so much to think about. What's one thing you would encourage our listeners to take away from this deep dive as they're processing all of this?
I think the most important thing is to remember that this is an ongoing conversation, a journey of discovery.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to wrestle with these difficult questions, or to challenge your own assumptions, or to just keep digging deeper into the text and into your own heart.
That's great advice. So much of faith is about that willingness to engage, to question, to wrestle with the complexity. Well, thank you so much for taking us on this deep dive into Isaiah 1.2731. I mean, your insights they've been so valuable.
Oh, it's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. We hope this deep dive has sparked some new insights and maybe even inspired you to do some exploring of your own. Until next time, keep those minds engaged and keep diving deep.